So it was super spontaneous, and we packed that night. And then my auntie lives in Seattle, so she picked us up in Seattle, drove us to the airport. And then my cousin Simone conveniently lives in Vegas, so she picked us up, and she works there at the Great Basin Institute, which is this scientific organization that just works with the desert landscape. And she drove us to the campsite. So usually, because this is a very popular place, especially in the springtime when climbing is just getting started in the year, it gets really, really busy, and you have to book a campsite months in advance. So if we had been thinking about it and planning, we probably would have looked for campsites in December, but we didn't think about it at all. We just decided we're only 2 people, we'll show up and see if anyone is nice enough to share their campsite with us, which is kind of how trips with Julia usually go. We usually don't plan. We've hitchhiked together. Do you know what hitchhiking is? Where you put your thumb out on the side of the road and a car comes and you go with them. Yeah, so we've hitchhiked together and gone on road trips together, and it's usually very fun and always really spontaneous, and you never know what to expect. So if you've seen a movie about road trips in the United States where really crazy stuff happens, it's not an exaggeration. Usually that stuff actually does happen, or if not that, something else equally bizarre. So anyways, we get to this campsite, and they look a lot like this. I'm not sure if any of you have ever been camping before. Maybe you have. But it's a really big thing in the United States. We have a ton of natural spaces, and a lot of it is public land. Public land is land that is set aside by the government, and it's owned by the people. So technically, you can go and camp or hike or do whatever as long as it's not a protected area. And so here there's a campsite, and they have these little shelters, and then you set up your tent, and that's where you sleep at night. And then Red Rock Canyon is this big loop road, and the campsite is at the very beginning. So to get to any of the climbing, we would hitchhike every day to the climbing route, and then we would climb all day and then go back to the campsite. So this is what it looks like in Red Rock Canyon. The rocks are obviously red, and they're actually legitimately red. They're orangey, really, really beautiful. And there's a lot of variety in the type of rock, which you'll see later in the pictures. Some of the animal life, there's a lot of lizards. There was this one of the first routes that I did actually. I was climbing up this rock, and there's this really deep cut in the rock, so it's a shelf. And I get to that part, and I look into this tall slice in the rock, and there's these 2 lizards that are this big, just hanging out on the ground. And I can't remember what they're called right now, but they're very typical in the desert, and they're not deadly, they're not dangerous, they're really, really nice. And you just kind of go on your way, and you keep hanging out there and it's all chill. And then there's cactus, just like in Almeria. There's a bunch of cactus. Prickly pear is what this one is. And some years there's this thing, and it's called the super bloom. And it's when all of the cactus have finally stored enough energy to bloom, and they all bloom at the same time. And this was a super bloom year. Red Rocks doesn't have a ton of cactus, so we didn't see like truly what the super bloom was like, but we did get to see some really beautiful cactus. So this is Julia, and that's me. One cool thing about the landscape in Red Rocks is that there's a bunch of what we call slot canyons. And a slot canyon is a canyon where there's like very thin walls like this. You kind of have to like crawl in between them. Sometimes they get like super narrow and you're like climbing up like on the side of the wall to keep going. And it's just super cool. One thing that you have to worry about and be mindful of is that if it starts to rain and you're in a slot canyon, these things called flash floods occur. And a flash flood is when all of the water drains into these slot canyons. And it's really dangerous. You can actually drown. So if it starts raining in the desert, you need to get out of the slot canyon, basically. More pictures of like what Red Rocks looks like. It's really, really beautiful there. So, like I said, Julia and I